Kara Winters thought she'd finally found stability when Luis Alvarez entered her life. But within months, her 2-year-old daughter, Maddie, began showing signs of something far darker: bruises, silence, and an eerie withdrawal. When Maddie vanished without a trace, what seemed like a tragic disappearance quickly turned into something far more chilling. As the investigation unraveled, authorities discovered a hidden world of abuse, trafficking, and betrayal, leading them to a shocking truth that no one could have predicted. What if the one person Kara trusted the most was the one responsible for her daughter's suffering? And what if Maddie was only one of many children caught in his web? When Kara Winters met Luis Alvarez, she was exhausted, lonely, and clinging to hope. At just 22 years old, she had already lived a life more difficult than most twice her age. A single mother to a bright and energetic 2-year-old girl named Maddie, Kara was juggling 2 part-time jobs while taking night classes at a local community college. Her days were long, her bills were overdue, and her dreams felt far away. When she crossed paths with Luis at a small coffee shop near campus, it felt like fate handing her a break. He was quiet but warm, with a thick accent and soft eyes. He said he had just moved to the US from Ecuador and was trying to start over. That made 2 of them. At first, Kara kept things slow. She didn't want to bring anyone into Maddie's life unless she was sure. But Luis didn't push. He offered to help with groceries, fixed a leaky faucet in her apartment, and listened when she talked about her fears and hopes. Within a few weeks, he was spending nights at her place. Maddie, still too young to understand much, seemed okay with the change. Kara was just relieved to have someone who didn't judge her for being tired or struggling. Luis got a job at a small auto repair shop downtown. He worked long hours and rarely spoke about his past. Kara didn't ask many questions. He seemed grateful to be in the US and told her he wanted to build a life with her. Friends were happy for her, saying she finally looked less stressed. Kara began to believe this was what stability looked like, but there were small things, details so minor they barely registered. Luis never took Maddie anywhere alone, but he insisted on giving her baths. He said it gave Kara time to rest. When Maddie cried at night, he was the first to check on her. Kara thought it was sweet. If Maddie had bruises, Kara blamed clumsy, toddler behavior. Everyone said kids that age got bumps and scrapes all the time. Looking back, Kara would later say the shift was so gradual she didn't notice it happening. But in truth, there were moments, fleeting flickers of unease, that she brushed aside. The silence after Maddie's laughter faded, the way she sometimes shrank away from touch, the shadows under her eyes. Kara didn't see the storm coming, or maybe deep down she did, and chose not to look. Maddie used to be full of life, always giggling, always curious. She loved stacking blocks, dancing in circles, and watching the same cartoons on repeat. But after Luis moved in, something in her began to change. Slowly at first. Her laughter became rare. She clung more tightly to her stuffed rabbit, wouldn't make eye contact with strangers, and sometimes sat staring at nothing for minutes on end. Kara noticed the differences, but life was busy, and she chalked it up to normal toddler mood swings or maybe teething. When Maddie began wetting the bed again, Kara blamed stress from daycare. It never occurred to her that something darker could be the cause. The bruises started appearing around the same time, first on her knees, then her upper arms. Kara asked Maddie what happened, but Maddie just looked away or said, "I don't know." Kara assumed she was falling during playtime, maybe on the jungle gym. She mentioned it once to Luis, and he told her not to worry. Kids got bruises. "You worry too much," he said with a smile that made Kara feel silly for even bringing it up. She believed him. At Maddie's daycare, teachers began writing incident reports. Bruises were noted, and one teacher became concerned about the child's growing silence and emotional withdrawal. She called social services. A caseworker visited Kara's apartment a week later. Kara cleaned everything beforehand, made sure the toys were neatly stacked, Maddie was in fresh clothes, and everything looked normal. The visit was brief. Kara said all the right things. the caseworker left with no red flags officially raised. Meanwhile, neighbors had started to notice strange things. Maddie's crying sometimes echoed through the walls late at night, but no one knocked. Some heard yelling but assumed Kara was just stressed. Luis never spoke to anyone. He avoided eye contact, moved quickly between his car and the apartment, and often kept the blinds shut. When a neighbor saw Maddie in the stairwell one day with what looked like a burn on her leg, she almost called someone, but didn't. It was easier to assume it was nothing. Everything looked normal on the surface. Kara was still smiling, still showing up to work. Luis was quiet and polite. But inside the walls of that small apartment, a little girl was slowly disappearing, and no one, not daycare staff, not neighbors, not even her own mother, could see just how close the danger had already come. Kara had always seen herself as a survivor. She'd faced a hard childhood, an absent father, and a teenage pregnancy that left her feeling abandoned by most of her family. So when Luis came into her life and offered comfort, she clung to it. He brought structure to the chaos. He paid rent when she couldn't. He cooked dinner, folded laundry, and said he loved both her and Maddie like family. To Kara, that was more than enough. She didn't want to lose what little peace she had finally found, so when things felt off, she made excuses. She noticed Maddie flinching when Luis entered the room, but told herself it was just a phase. She ignored the way Maddie sometimes cried during diaper changes, saying it was normal toddler sensitivity. When her sister came to visit and immediately said Maddie looked too thin, Kara became defensive. She snapped, said daycare must not be feeding her properly. When her sister pointed out more bruises, Kara ended the visit early and didn't return her calls for weeks. At work, Kara became more withdrawn. Friends tried to check in, but she brushed them off. "Just tired," she'd say. "Maddie's been keeping me up." Luis had begun insisting Kara take naps when she came home from work. He'd send her to bed and keep Maddie occupied. "You need rest," he told her, and it sounded like kindness. Kara convinced herself she was lucky. Not every mom had someone to step in like that. She stopped questioning the locked door to Maddie's room at night. Luis said it was safer that way, so Maddie wouldn't wander. Kara agreed, even though Maddie had never been the type to sleepwalk. She stopped asking about the marks on Maddie's legs. Luis always had an explanation. She fell. She bumped into something. It happened at daycare. Kara repeated those answers when others asked. Somewhere deep down, Kara felt the growing discomfort. But every time she faced it, she pictured her life falling apart. Again. She pictured losing Luis, losing control, and starting all over. So instead of asking hard questions, she clung to the idea that things weren't really that bad. That she was overreacting, that Maddie would be fine. But Maddie wasn't fine, and Kara's silence, her denial, was slowly giving space for something terrible to take root, right in front of her, in the home she thought she had finally made safe. It was an overcast February morning when everything changed. Kara had left the apartment early to run errands, leaving Maddie in Luis's care, something that had become routine by then. She trusted him. He'd watched Maddie dozens of times before, and nothing had ever gone seriously wrong, at least not that she'd allowed herself to believe. But that morning, when she came home with bags of groceries and called out Maddie's name, the apartment was silent. Luis stood in the living room, pale and tense, and told her Maddie was gone. He said he had turned his back for just a minute, that Maddie had been playing near the door, and when he looked again, she was gone. No sounds, no struggle, just vanished. Kara froze. Panic took over. She ran out into the street, yelling Maddie's name, knocking on neighbors' doors, scanning sidewalks and nearby yards, but there was no sign of the toddler. Nothing. The police were called. Officers arrived quickly and began canvassing the area. Flyers were printed, and a statewide Amber Alert was issued by nightfall. Volunteers, neighbors, and strangers combed through parks, searched alleyways, and checked nearby wooded areas. Kara appeared on local news tearfully begging for Maddie's return. Luis stood beside her, quiet and solemn, but something about his stillness unsettled detectives. In interviews, Luis repeated the same vague timeline, but small inconsistencies started to emerge. His story changed slightly each time. First she, was near the door than she was playing in her room. He couldn't recall what time exactly he noticed her missing. He couldn't remember what clothes she was wearing. Investigators noticed scratches on his hands. When asked, he said he got them fixing a car. Kara was questioned too, and her version lined up with Luis's, but detectives sensed something off. Neither seemed panicked enough. Neither could explain how a child could disappear from a locked apartment in the middle of the day. Surveillance footage from nearby buildings was reviewed. No one matching Maddie's description was seen leaving. No witnesses came forward. There were no signs of forced entry. 2 days later, Luis disappeared. He didn't show up to work. His phone went dead. His car was found abandoned near the edge of town. Inside was a bag packed with clothes, some cash, and a fake ID. It was then that police realized Maddie hadn't wandered off. She had been taken, and the man Kara trusted had vanished with her. Investigators shifted their focus to Luis Alvarez. With Maddie still missing and Luis now a fugitive, the case turned from a disappearance into something far more sinister. Police retraced his steps, scouring the places he frequented: the auto shop, the apartment, and the storage unit he'd rented just weeks earlier. Nothing pointed to Maddie's whereabouts, but it was a tip from a former co-worker at the auto shop that cracked the case wide open. The man mentioned that Luis had a private room in the back of the shop that no one else was allowed to enter. He said Luis always locked it and warned others to stay out, claiming it was where he kept expensive equipment. That detail caught detectives' attention. They obtained a warrant and descended on the small, cluttered garage that sat on the edge of town. To the average eye, the shop looked normal. Stacks of tires, greasy tools, and oil-stained floors. But in the back, hidden behind a wall of shelves and toolboxes, they discovered a door that led to a narrow concrete stairwell. Down those steps was a hidden basement room. What they found inside would haunt even the most seasoned officers. The space was cold and windowless, with soundproof padding on the walls. There was a cot, a metal cage, a chair with restraints, and several cameras set up at various angles. Lights were rigged to trip switches, and the walls were lined with electrical outlets and cords. A locked cabinet held dozens of flash drives and hard drives. On a nearby shelf were children's clothes, including a pair of pink pajamas identified as Maddie's. There was no sign of Maddie herself, but digital forensics would soon confirm what investigators feared. The files contained horrifying footage of abuse, dates marked and cataloged in hidden folders. The timestamps showed activity dating back months. Some of the videos had been uploaded to encrypted servers. Transactions, usernames, and chat logs pointed to a much larger network. The discovery turned a missing child case into an international crime investigation. The press caught wind quickly, and within hours, headlines across the country lit up with the news. The FBI joined the case, and warrants were issued for suspected associates linked through the digital evidence. What had begun as a quiet search for a little girl was now a national emergency. Behind the closed doors of an ordinary garage, investigators had uncovered something far more terrifying than they ever imagined. As federal agents began to sift through the digital files recovered from the basement of Luis Alvarez's auto shop, the full scale of what they were dealing with came into focus. This was not the work of a lone predator. The evidence pointed to a well-organized, deeply concealed international child trafficking ring. Hidden within encrypted folders were logs of financial transactions, usernames linked to the dark web, and hours of footage documenting abuse. Some, involving other children authorities had never seen before. The content was systematic. Every video had a title, a timestamp, and a disturbing code that investigators later realized corresponded to buyer requests. It became clear Luis wasn't just producing the footage. He was facilitating access, selling live stream sessions, and communicating with foreign contacts who coordinated the movement of victims across borders. The FBI confirmed that several of the usernames in the chat logs matched individuals already under investigation in other countries for child exploitation. One file contained scans of passports and documents from 3 different countries, indicating children had been trafficked internationally using forged identities. Maddie's name appeared only a few times, always with a code name attached, but her pajamas, her toys, and her drawings found in the basement left no doubt she had been one of the victims. The trail of evidence extended across multiple continents, reaching into underground networks in South America, Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia. Interpol was notified. Arrests followed in Colombia, Poland, and Thailand. One man captured in Bogota admitted to meeting Luis years before and confirmed that he acted as a recruiter, sending vulnerable children to the U.S. through fake adoption and travel schemes. He also confirmed the network Luis operated was known to shift locations frequently, using businesses like auto shops, warehouses, and even private homes as front operations. Despite the widespread crackdown, Luis himself remained missing. A fake passport and bank withdrawals made in Arizona, Nevada, and finally Texas suggested he may have been trying to flee the country. Authorities believed he had help, likely from others within the trafficking ring. As the scope of the network unraveled, the horror deepened. Maddie wasn't just a missing child. She had become part of a global system built on secrecy, money, and human suffering. Every lead brought hope, but also revealed how many children had fallen into the same trap, and how many more remained unaccounted for. With the trafficking network exposed, investigators began locating survivors, children who had endured similar horrors and lived to tell their stories. Many had no idea who Luis Alvarez was by name, but when shown his photo, several recognized him immediately. One young girl rescued from a safe house in Colombia pointed to his image and whispered, "El Mecánico," the mechanic. That was the name he used in multiple countries. He posed as a caretaker, a helper, sometimes even a savior. In every case, he exploited trust to gain access, then vanished when suspicion grew. The survivors' stories revealed a chilling pattern. Luis targeted single mothers, often poor or isolated. He built relationships with them, played the role of protector, and then quietly took control. He would offer to babysit, then isolate the children. Some were moved across borders using fake adoption papers or false family credentials. Others were never seen again. Those who were rescued told stories of being held in basements, trailers, or locked rooms, always watched, always afraid. In the U.S., authorities connected Luis to two other cases previously marked as unrelated runaways. Both children had briefly lived in the same city where Luis operated under a different alias. Their families had received anonymous cash transfers shortly before the disappearances, now believed to be payments meant to keep them silent or confused. With each new piece of evidence, the reach of the operation became more apparent and more terrifying. A few survivors formed the heart of what investigators began calling the Survivors Network. With help from therapists and law enforcement, these children began to identify other traffickers from images, routines, and language used during their captivity. Their courage became critical in unraveling the darkest corners of the ring. Their memories, though incomplete and painful, helped agents map out routes, safe houses, and patterns Luis and his partners used to stay hidden. Public outcry intensified as media reports revealed how long the network had operated without detection. Questions were raised about how many warning signs had been missed, not just in Maddie's case but in others too. Officials promised reform, but the children who had suffered couldn't be restored with policy. Their stories were reminders of what had been lost. And still, there was no sign of Maddie. As arrests continued and connections were made, hope remained, but it grew thinner with each passing week. As the investigation expanded, the focus began to shift back to Kara Winters. Public sympathy, once firmly in her corner, began to fade. Questions emerged. How much did she really know? Could she have truly been so unaware of what was happening inside her own home? Detectives who had initially viewed her as another victim now began to examine her more closely. Her phone was confiscated and combed through, along with her laptop and social media accounts. What they found suggested a more complicated truth. Deleted messages between Kara and Luis hinted at secrets being kept. In one message, Kara asked Luis if they had sent the money yet. Another message referenced keeping things quiet for a while. Investigators traced several unexplained cash deposits to her bank account, amounts too large and too frequent to be tips or side work. Kara claimed she thought the money came from Luis's auto business, but she had no records to prove it. Search history from her devices also raised red flags. She had looked up symptoms of abuse, how to report a missing child, and, even more disturbingly, how long a toddler could survive without food. When asked about these searches, Kara became emotional and inconsistent in her explanations. She claimed she had always been suspicious, that she felt something was wrong, but was afraid to confront it. She insisted Luis had manipulated her, controlled her, and kept her isolated. She said she feared for her life and for Maddie's. The prosecution, however, believed otherwise. They argued that Kara had grown dependent on Luis, not just emotionally, but financially, and had turned a blind eye to the abuse out of fear of losing the support he provided. They charged her with felony child endangerment, obstruction of justice, and aiding in the concealment of a crime. Her trial divided the public. Some saw a broken woman too terrified to act. Others saw a mother who had chosen her own comfort over her child's safety. In the courtroom, photos of Maddie, before and after, were shown. The bruises, the weight loss, the hollow stare. Kara wept through the proceedings, often unable to lift her head. But the evidence kept mounting. Whether she had known everything or only pieces of it, one thing was clear. Her silence had allowed it to continue. Kara's trial began amidst a media frenzy. The courtroom was packed with reporters, photographers, and the weight of public opinion. On one side, there were those who believed Kara was a victim of manipulation, a young woman trapped by a controlling and violent man. On the other side were those who couldn't fathom how a mother could turn a blind eye to the suffering of her own child. For many, the images of Maddie, once vibrant and full of life, now just a memory frozen in photographs, were a constant reminder of what had been lost. Kara's defense team painted a picture of a woman isolated by fear. They argued that Kara had never fully understood what was happening to her daughter, that she had been so emotionally and psychologically controlled by Luis that she couldn't see the signs of abuse. They presented her as a vulnerable young woman struggling to make ends meet, who had been preyed upon by a manipulative and dangerous man. Her actions, they claimed, were driven by confusion, fear, and love, a misguided belief that she was keeping Maddie safe by not confronting Luis. The prosecution, however, painted a much darker picture. They showed how Kara had repeatedly brushed off warnings, first from daycare workers, then from friends, and later from authorities. They played the audio recordings of her phone calls, where she repeatedly lied about Maddie's well-being, where she excused bruises and strange behaviors. The prosecution argued that Kara had been complicit in Maddie's suffering by refusing to confront the truth, by ignoring the glaring signs of abuse in favor of maintaining a comfortable, stable life with Luis. Their case was simple. Kara had chosen to ignore her daughter's pain, to turn a blind eye to the abuse because the alternative, leaving Luis, confronting him, and possibly losing the security he provided, was too difficult. In the courtroom, Kara sat in silence, her face often hidden behind her hands. She cried, frequently, but said little. At one point she broke down and admitted, "I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to lose him, and I didn't know how to protect her." It was a moment that humanized her, but also underscored the tragedy of her choices. The jury was left to wrestle with this duality. Was Kara a victim herself, manipulated and terrified, or was she a mother who failed to protect her child out of fear, apathy, or ignorance? After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. They found Kara guilty of child endangerment and obstruction of justice, but they stopped short of convicting her for trafficking or direct involvement in Maddie's abuse. The judge sentenced her to 12 years in prison, a sentence that some viewed as too lenient, while others believed it reflected the complexity of her situation. Outside the courthouse, the public's opinion remained divided. Some held out hope that Kara could be rehabilitated, that she could find redemption in the years to come. But for many, the question that lingered was whether she could ever forgive herself for failing to protect the one person she was supposed to love above all else: her daughter. 2 years passed since Maddie's disappearance, and the case had slowly faded from the headlines, but the memory of her still haunted those who had followed it closely. The trial was over, but the questions remained unanswered. Where was Maddie? Had she been sold into the shadows of the trafficking ring Luis had worked for, or had something more sinister happened to her? Despite a worldwide search and countless efforts from law enforcement, Maddie remained missing, her fate unknown. Meanwhile, Kara's life inside the prison system was a far cry from the image of the carefree young mother she had once been. Every day in her cell, she was forced to confront the truth. She had failed Maddie. Though she had been sentenced to 12 years, the guilt weighed heavier on her than any punishment could. She spent hours each day writing letters to Maddie, messages of apology and sorrow that she would never be able to send. In her mind, she replayed every moment, every sign she had missed, and she wondered if there was anything she could have done differently, anything at all to save her daughter from the horrors that had unfolded. Kara was allowed one brief visitor every month, and her mother came regularly. Their relationship, once strained, had grown somewhat stronger during her incarceration. Yet even her mother couldn't understand how Kara had failed to see what was happening right under her nose. The guilt Kara carried seemed to separate them further, an invisible wall that made it hard to talk about anything beyond basic pleasantries. Meanwhile, law enforcement continued their search for Maddie, but new leads were few and far between. The digital evidence they had uncovered in the auto shop had led to several arrests, and some of the other children connected to Luis had been rescued, but Maddie's name remained absent from the list of survivors. Investigators theorized that she had been moved to a new location before the network was dismantled. But even after interrogating those involved in the trafficking ring, no one had concrete information about where Maddie was or whether she was still alive. It was as if she had vanished into the vast, dark network of predators that stretched across continents. In the years following the bust of the trafficking ring, efforts to reform laws and increase public awareness gained traction. But for the victims, for the families like Kara's, the fight was far from over. The scars left by the horrors of what had transpired remained etched into their lives, no matter how much time passed. For Maddie's family, and for all the other children whose names had never made the news, the question remained: how many others had slipped through the cracks of a system that allowed such evil to thrive for so long? And for Kara, the guilt was an endless ache, a constant reminder that sometimes the biggest danger isn't the monsters we can see, but the ones we allow to walk into our lives.